Welcome to Byzantium and Friends, a podcast where we talk about things that we can't necessarily see. One of those things, of course, is what people are thinking, or what people were thinking. It's one of the main reasons why the social sciences never became fully proper sciences, in the sense of being able to make predictions. That is because we can never really know what people are thinking, and as a result, their behavior often appears unpredictable or inexplicable. That is also why we have the humanities, to understand and interpret that behavior and the various products and arts and literature that people produce, but after the fact, we can never predict it. This uncertainty, which is a driver of so much history, it's also what makes history so fascinating and interesting. Not just history, but our own lived experience, is what's driving so many attempts, especially by tech companies, to use technologies such as eye tracking software to try to divine what's going on in people's minds when they're looking at products or advertisements, and thereby to try to create some sort of technical science by which people's levels of actual interest can be gauged, measured, reduced to metrics, possibly predicted, shaped, and manipulated. We will inevitably see how those turn out. In the meantime, as historians, we look at institutions that had vested interest in knowing what people thought or believed or who they were on the inside, but not being able to know those things. One of those, for example, was the Christian Church, especially after Constantine, when so many new members joined it, but who they were exactly was unknown even to the church authorities of the time. Who was a real Christian? You could never know what people actually believed. They could easily be faking it. Saying that you believed in certain doctrines was a different thing from actually going to church, which was a different thing than behaving as a Christian. And all of these produced very different categories of classification as to who was a true Christian. Ultimately, many people who cared about genuine belief wanted to know what people believed. This, of course, was impossible. Even so, this did not stop people from constructing models by which to understand or interpret other people's minds, or to somehow get into those minds and see the truth of their content. And in many ways, this is a sort of persistent and natural drive of the human mind, given the way that it evolved in its original environment. The human mind, a great deal of human cognition evolved in order to cope with complex social groups and human interrelations. In other words, to know, who's on your side, who's not, who you can count on, who likes you, who doesn't like you. And it was these aspects and challenges of the original environment that have left us with the brains that we have, which are so attuned to things like gossip and suspicion and second-guessing, and in which we can construct very elaborate social networks and position ourselves in them. Even while at the same time we have very underdeveloped cognitive modules for dealing with things like risk, right? Like you tell people like under COVID that maybe they have a 1% chance of succumbing to the disease. But do they think that's high or low? And I think there were some polls which said that most people found that to be a very low, even acceptable level of risk. 1%. If you imagine 1 out of every 100 people succumbing to the disease, or let's say 1 out of every 100 airplanes that are in the air at any time falling, people would never get on an airplane again if that were the case, because while we can do the math, we're kind of terrible at translating it into our own lived experience and the decisions that we have to make. It's the same for projecting the long-term consequences of our actions. Anyway, but when it comes to things like social networking, gossip, and trying to understand or read other people's minds, we have a very sophisticated apparatus for interpreting signals, facial expressions, nuances, things said, things unsaid. And folks in late antiquity were doing this, as much as anyone anywhere. And they constructed some pretty interesting models for trying to interpret or project the minds of others, things that they can't see, but which they're very interested in seeing. And this is the topic on which my guest today has written a fascinating little book. It's a wonderful read. My guest is Ellen Muehlberger, who's been on the podcast before, and she's a professor at the University of Michigan. An all-around very funny and fun and super smart person to have on a podcast. I'm very, very happy that she agreed to come on again. And also to write this book, which it's a short book. It has 4 case studies dealing with late antiquity. And I love the precision with which its thoughts are unwound. Now, the setup of the book is an interesting topic in itself, and we discussed that at the beginning of the discussion. The book is called Things Unseen, Essays on Evidence, Knowledge, and the Late Ancient World. It just came out. I found it a tremendously engaging read. Now, we won't be able to discuss all of the case studies here. We focus on 2 and drop some teasers about the 4th, which is the Fayum portraits. Which these are death masks from which modern scholars have tried to intuit or interpret or understand or get to know the inner lives of the people they represent, because these are famously, quote, realistic portraits. And that's a problem in sort of modern attempts to see things unseen. Otherwise, we focus on the first 2 case studies. So without any further delay, here's my conversation with Ellen, and thanks also to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Ellen, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me again. I'm so delighted to be back.
So before we talk about the book, I'm going to start at the real beginning where I paused for a few seconds. 4 Dodds read the dedication, and I thought, no, it can't be the Dodds I was thinking of.
Everyone thinks it's E.R. Dodds. Is this who you were thinking of?
Yes.
Yes, no. I had a beloved cat named Dodds. He was not named after E.R. Dodds. He was named after a street that I lived on in graduate school in Bloomington, Indiana. And he passed away just as I was finishing the book, unfortunately. So, and he, as I explained in the acknowledgments, he was quite involved in the production. I guess if a book is a product, if there was a set of notes, he laid on top of it. It was if there was a pencil I was moving, he was playing with it. He was just a very involved cat. And so it seemed the right thing to do.
His paws are all over it, right? Yeah.
They really are. And, if people know me, I will send them pictures of Dodds sitting on their book or sitting on a set of notes about their article. He was everywhere. He was such a good boy.
And the street wasn't named in turn after E.R. Dodds.
I don't think so. I actually don't know the history of how that street got named, but it was, grad school cities tend to imprint upon you. And that house particularly imprinted upon me as, the first house that I lived in that wasn't an apartment,
Right.
It was a great place. I did a lot there, and I wrote a dissertation there, and it felt good.
When I saw the connection isn't entirely far-fetched, because, what he was trying to do with the Greeks as a sort of psychologize them as not just perfect beings of rationality, but it's kind of similar
Indeed.
to what you do too. So I thought maybe, but okay, no. Okay, it was a cat. All right. So, well, farewell, Dodds, wherever you are.
Godspeed.
All right. So you do something very interesting in this book. I was actually kind of laughing a little bit. It was very funny. So you talk about the lecture series format of book, and that you wrote this to be like that. Can you explain to the audience? I think many in the audience will not know what that type of book is, and so what you're trying to do here.
Got it. So there are, in ancient studies and maybe centered on classics, but there's a few in history too, there are these lecture series that are annual or biennial that a university or an institution will hold, where they ask a scholar to come for multiple days. So over the course of 4 days, you might be invited to give 4 lectures across a theme, or sometimes 3 or sometimes 2. But usually after you give that set of lectures, after you've been invited, you've written them, you've delivered them live, often the institution will ask the person to produce a book out of them, or produce a small, you might want to produce a series of articles, but there's usually a book. And those books, before I went to graduate school, before I decided I would be an academic, I read those books kind of as an interested observer of the field, especially around early Christianity, classics, the Roman world. There's a lot of them. And I loved those books. I loved them so much because they were meant a bit introductory. They were written for not a reader who needed to check every single footnote and look up every single reference, but just someone who
Hmm.
wanted a take on a theme or an interesting set of observations about a theme, but something that happened to be about antiquity. And the presence of those books, I just didn't, as a reader, I didn't know how they got produced. But then as I went to graduate school and became an academic and watched who got invited for those lectures, I thought, gosh, I'm not ever going to be invited to give one of these things, but I
Hmm.
really want to write a book like that.
Hmm.
So it was born of a desire to have the kind of voice that those books had, and I tried. We'll see if it feels like a lecture book, but
Oh,
I
I think
yeah,
you succeeded. I mean, I know exactly the kind of book you mean, and I have not been invited to these either, but I think it has something to do with our fields too. I think they're very sort of mainstream classics oriented, most of them. I know the books. They're usually on the shorter side. They're um, much more accessible, and it's usually some senior scholar among friends, just expressing some ideas, just sometimes experimentally, sometimes this is where I have been led to after decades of studying this, right? That kind of thing. And yeah, I started to think about how many I've attended some of those lectures at Michigan. There was what is it, Jerome,
the
I think.
Jeromes are at
Yeah,
Michigan.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It was, but it's always, yeah, it's always like it's either Fergus Miller or Glenn Bowersock or Peter Brown. It's always those people usually that have those books. But
Those
anyway,
guys.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
Um,
those, I like writing opportunities because they help you produce or evoke what things you might have been thinking otherwise, but maybe wouldn't have put to paper.
mhm,
And so the lecture series, especially, it's just such an interesting writing assignment. If you think, we are long past being in coursework, we're not getting writing assignments anymore, but that is a kind of writing assignment. Think through something with four related
mhm.
products that are going to appeal to an audience that might include, first year undergraduates up to people who are about to retire and probably a librarian and maybe some members of the public who aren't even associated with the institution. That's a
Mm.
wild writing opportunity. And we just don't get that kind of opportunity or that sort of prompt for our own writing, mostly in academia.
So the reason I was kind of giggling while I was reading this, when I realized what you had done here, is because then I was trying to imagine you being invited to now give these as lectures, sort of reversing the usual order, right? And it actually reminded me of the Acts of the Lateran Council of 649, where I think they wrote the Acts before they had the actual meeting. I mean,
Councils are wild for that. And the idea of tacking back and forth between what seems to be a live delivery, but is of course not a live delivery. Even people who quote speak off the cuff, if they do it well, are never speaking off the cuff. And then trying to tack back into a writing style that you're going to read on a page, that's hard. It's hard
yes.
to do.
So were you like impersonating a lecture series book as a kind of speech and character? That is, I mean, were you self-conscious about the style of, presentation while you were writing this, as if you were preparing for like a lecture somewhere?
I tried very hard to make it so that it wasn't a written narrative. It was something that could be read aloud, although, of course, recently I just gave a talk based on one of the chapters, and the talk organizers gave me 20 minutes to present the chapter. The chapter might be more like 8 to 10,000 words, somewhere in
Hmm.
there. And it was incredibly hard to go back to spoken after I had written something that, appears on the page. Those are
Right.
two, they're just, we
Yeah,
think
yeah.
about writing and a lecture as the presentation of writing, but a lecture is not at all the presentation of writing. It's the performance of an argument. And that those are
Mhm.
two very different things. Arguments on the page are just a different beast.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
I did try to keep in mind the lecture format and to have the kind of tone, particularly the two things I notice about those kinds of things are the tone of the lecture is authoritative yet curious. So I tried to have that voice. They also tend to do a little bit of unex- unexpected juxtaposition. So let's talk about some things that don't seem like they go together, and now let's think about how they do go together. That's a pretty
Hmm.
typical
Hmm.
rhetorical approach to a lecture. So I tried to do some of that. Again, an attempt. It's an attempt.
Well, I think it succeeds wonderfully. I enjoyed reading this a lot, and I particularly liked just following the exposition of your thoughts, you kind of unwind with great precision, actually, which I really appreciate. Precision in writing is something that is kind of rarer than you would expect. Anyway, well done.
Oh, gosh, thank
I
you.
enjoyed these. Also, when I knew at the same time that this was a deliberate rhetorical exercise on your part, which I also appreciate. These are not easy to do. Anyway, so let's talk about some of the topics that you discuss in the book. We're really only going to discuss two of them, probably, maybe gesture toward a third, but readers can go look at it or read it. It's short and fun.
And actually free. Let me just interject. You literally could go click on a link
Yes,
in your browser and read this because California has made it open access.
yes, good, good. Yeah, I mean, I read
Sorry to interrupt you, but
everything. No,
it's
no,
it's
no.
short
It's
and it's
important.
free.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Important information. I read everything in like physical. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, So I think the general concern that propels the book is the difficulty or sort of impossibility of knowing certain kinds of things. I mean, it's called things unseen. In particular, the mind of other people, like what's going on inside the inner world, right, of other people. And we all, of course, use to external signs as proxies to indicate that. We have models. We model other people's inner world based on our own, which sometimes is, is terribly wrong. I, I've, there for years I thought that other people thought and operated the way I did as a junior academic, and it took me a while to figure out, no, 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 that's not the case. Anyway, so what drove you to focus on this question in the first place? Because much of your work is actually focused on internal states, and our last discussion on this podcast was about a different problem along those lines. So what is the problem that is worrying you here?
I I am fascinated by what the difference or the distance perhaps between what an experience must be like, whether it's a modern person or an ancient person, and what gets recorded in a way that people after that experience can access it. So in our case, you and I are working with sources that are both far removed and also um, themselves represent a kind of take on the world already before the source is even produced, right? So, if you're working with someone like there's a historian, Ammianus Marcellinus, if you're working with him, what you're reading about is he's interested in battles, he's interested in the intrigues between men who want to be emperor and the people who serve them, and whether those underlings are doing their job correctly or not. He's also interested in things like fate and the place of fate in the development of history. But you're not going to get an account from him about food preparation or really buildings or archaeology. You're probably not going to understand how people felt about the weather, the change of seasons, clothing, things that
Mhm.
if you ask me how my day goes, I think, well, gosh, it's cold today. I have on a hoodie. My there is sunshine, so my mood is different. Like these are all parts of the experience that don't get captured. And the subject that I focus on, early Christianity, has this kind of bent to it in terms of the sources that it has preserved from antiquity. Most of them are about holy topics. Most of them are about the topics that a group of officials, both imperial officials and church officials, thought were important, and they don't capture a lot of other things. And so I guess it's the distance between sources in general and what experience must have been like that
Mhm.
makes me think, how else could I read this source to get at something? At the same time, I will just 100% confess, I don't think that I'm ever actually getting at anyone's ancient experience. I think that is far removed from me, and I don't think it's accessible to us. Not to be nihilistic,
Yeah,
but
no, I mean, I I don't think that that kind of experience is available or accessible to us for people we know personally
indeed.
and can interview or interrogate about it. And I'm even not sure that our own is entirely accessible. And that's what psychology is telling us now, right? That what we think our self-consciousness is something that is a derivative product. It's not what's actually going on. It's the way it's represented to a module in our brain.
we have lots of stories about motivation, our own motivation and,
Yeah,
other people's motivations. We have those stories kind of running on sort of a bandwidth that I
yeah,
think is different than the actual causes of things. And that can be, to go back to Ammianus Marcellinus for a moment. If you read him or other historians, especially late ancient historians, the main story you'll get is an emperor decided to do X, or um, a bishop decided to do X, or a bishop decided not to do X. And these are the levers that move culture. And I think you and I are, because we're well read in the humanities, we know that culture tends not to move at the whim of one person pulling a lever, right? Like
hmm,
there's a lot of things that lead to what looks like a single person's decision that is kind of parallel to a lot of things lead to me thinking, oh, I decided to do this rather than
hmm,
everything around me is
hmm.
working on me to make me feel like I've made that decision.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at your first case study. And this is, you call a boy in a rhetorical classroom who presumably his homework or his assignment is to compose and present before his peers a speech in character. And you can tell us what that is. And this is specifically a speech spoken as if he were a prostitute who has reformed her life, sort of come to her senses. So tell us what a speech and character is and why, or some of the topics that boys in rhetorical classrooms were asked to speak on, and why you chose this one.
Got it. There's a speech and character is one of maybe a dozen exercises, pretty standard exercises that writing instructors would have their students do. And students here would be, let's say, from 10 to 16 years old or so. So not well-developed writers yet, people who are practicing at writing, and mostly writing in order to be able to speak. So this is writing that isn't just going to land on the page, but mostly actually is going to be performed aloud. Speech and character was one of them. You've heard of others probably. Like so, there's a exercise in narrative, and students who perform the exercise in narrative are practicing storytelling. There's an exercise in invective, so that's an exercise in how to, you know, essentially to the word I'm looking for is corrugate is not the word. Excoriate is the word I'm looking for. It took a second to get there. Excoriate,
Burn, roast.
right? How to burn someone or how to roast someone. So speech and character is an odd one because it requires you to work in first person. So you adopt a character that you've been given by the prompt itself or by your teacher, and you attempt to create a first person speech that represents that character and their situation. And it's odd. Speeches in character that we have either we have the prompt question for or the model for almost always ask the student to do something that puts the quality of the character or the characteristics of the person that they're speaking for and their situation in tension. So it's things like an example that I use in the book is what would the eunuch say having fallen in love? So the idea there is a eunuch, a person who has undergone some sort of castration or whatever happens to create a eunuch, cannot possibly be in love. And we as modern people would think, well, of course they can. Like I love lots of things and I love people, whether I'm
Right.
sexually involved in them or not.
Yeah.
The assumption here, though, from the ancient perspective is, well, that person couldn't possibly participate in what is being called love. And then you realize, oh, what they mean is penetrative sex. That's what they mean. So it's a kind of exercise that is built upon attention. So a student is challenged to speak as someone who is in tension with their own qualities, but it's super useful if you're trying to suss out what people think is the norm in antiquity because you can look at the tension and be like, oh, eunuch and love don't go together for these people. Ah, what does that possibly mean? And in this case, a woman who is a sex worker and the quality that the speech and character that I write about asks her to assume is sophrosune. So it's like wisdom or self-possession or agency. Um, those two things, a sex worker and wisdom can't possibly go together. And that's realizing that that's a basic assumption that you can just hand to a 12-year-old burgeoning writer and
Hmm.
say, work on this because obviously you, young boy, think this is absolutely absurd too. That tells you a lot about the culture. What does it think is absurd?
Right. So I'll ask you about that in a moment. I'm especially interested in speech and character because I think tomorrow I'm giving a lecture here to to undergraduate students. And I think I'm going to do it from the standpoint of someone in the 14th century, which is why
Ah,
I made that turban hat that I sent you a photo of.
excellent.
I,
Excellent.
I think I'm going to wear that to signal I am now speaking as Metochites.
Well,
And
what's his conflict? What conflict is he in? What is the tension that he has to resolve?
oh, well, this is two students in the democracy corps. And he wrote essays on democracy, which he thought was bad. But anyway, yeah, I'm putting him in a difficult situation to um, explain how the political system that he was a part of benefited the majority of the subjects of the East Roman state. Now, this is in a very difficult time, and I'm going to hold him to the standards of democracy that he outlined in his essays on democracy. Anyway, these haven't been translated. He's a notoriously obscure writer. And anyway, he was also extremely corrupt as an official and ended badly. So that's something I'm also working in. But you know, there's an
Presumably being corrupt,
accountability.
though, was not in, presumably being corrupt is not part of his standards of democracy.
Um, it is
Oh,
because this is accountability. And the ancient Athenians, their constitution, they had the Athenae, which were like holding public officials accountable, but it was a formal institution. In his case, it was Roman style. Basically, the populace rose up and took out the regime and burned his house, and like it was accountability, but a very different kind. So I'm gonna sort of make him try to face the music a little bit. Okay, we're getting, but I
no,
wish I
that's all
were
right.
more. I wish I were better trained in speech and character, is what I'm saying.
Well, I will give you one piece of advice, which is that you have to try to embody him, not just what he would say, but students, ancient students were told that they had to try to take on the diction, the gestures, the
Hmm.
emotional tone, like the mien of people
Yes.
that they were embodying. So in this case, boys who were, again, 10 to 16, maybe 12, 13, were being asked to act out what they thought an adult female sex worker who had become wise would act like. So where you can imagine
Oh,
these are people who,
mannerisms, like
oh
oh,
yeah, totally, 100%. So these are not people who have a lot of experience, arguably, with adult female sex workers, whether they're wise or not.
hmm,
So
hmm.
then there opens a door for a lot of caricature, a lot of performance of what you expect the other people in the room, namely teenage boys and your teacher, to think women are like. There's not a lot of women in these. I mean, I said it was a boy writer because statistically there were not a lot of women who went through this
Sure.
curriculum, and it tended to be single sex classrooms. So you, as a boy, are performing for other boys what you think a fornicating woman was like. Like you can see how that goes
Yeah.
far away from the documentary very quickly. And
Um,
now we're into the realm of the imagination.
but why would the curriculum expect them to do this? I mean, this is not something, this is not even the kind of person they would necessarily encounter in their political or professional careers. So, what's the pedagogical goal here?
That was a question that bothered me for a long time, and there have been answers by other scholars. So other people have talked about that performing as women, and boys were asked to perform as women in these exercises about 30% of the time. So performing as women was a way to have boys experience the whole of gender, or it was a way for them to make connections with emotions that they weren't allowed in other situations. So that, it was to benefit them in some way or give them a breadth of experience that they didn't have. And I always felt not satisfied by those answers. Those might be true. Those might well be the
Mm.
intentions of teachers. But I was also interested in how, if you learn to speak as someone, particularly in this kind of caricaturing or stereotyping way, you then have a sense that you know them, maybe even know them intimately. And thus, when you meet someone from that group, you might not actually let that new instance register with you. You might always be working with the thing that you yourself came up with, maybe when you were
Mm.
12.
Hmm. So, my experience in terms of my own scholarship with this body of material is largely related to historiography and in composition. In other words, if you're, like, say, Procopius, or Ammianus for that matter, I think he had the same
Yeah.
training, and you are writing not only about battles and political speeches, but also all kinds of people show up in historical narratives, um, you need to be able to represent them in a manner that is consistent with the cultural idiom of yourself and your readers, right?
Yeah.
And that the weird range of topics that these schoolboys are trained in is, I think, giving them a repertoire of rhetorical composition that they can use for whatever. So, for example, I mean, in the classroom, they're also reading like tragedies and comedies and things like this. And some of these characters do appear there. Though I don't know, they're not actually composing those kinds of texts, but whatever. Let me ask a question about ethics here, because it has been argued, one can argue, that this kind of representation that is putting yourself in the subject position of someone else who is very, very different in life circumstances from you might instill a kind of empathy, right, for the other, especially someone who's far less favored in the kind of socioeconomic hierarchy. But this is not the approach that you take. And we, like, there is there's a temptation to hope, I think, that classical texts do those kinds of things,
Hmm.
right? Like create empathy and so on. And I was actually very and I sympathize with that. I get it. I also want them to do that. But I was also very happy to see you push back against it and do something different. So you see these as exercises in continued domination. Um, can you explain that? Like, how did you come to that reading?
It was very simple. If these were exercises in empathy, if every single writer who went through the traditional curriculum had spent 30% of his time speaking as women, arguably the social and political structures of the ancient world would be a far more egalitarian context, right? Like we would see, oh gosh, these are people who have empathy for what it's like to be a woman. Therefore, they won't expect women to be objects or property or and that just didn't turn out that way. Like regardless of whether we're in the centuries that I'm better at or the centuries that you're better at, there are exceptional women, but in general, women as a class are not taken to be agents or political entities of their own. So somehow that the empathy theory or the empathy theory can't be true because it would have had a much bigger splash in late ancient culture. So then I was like, what else is this doing? And at the time, uh, I was teaching a class for history undergraduate majors who had just declared their major. So it was like a brand new, you've just become a history major, and here are some of the theoretical works that you have to read. And I was reading around, thinking about things to put on the syllabus.
Hmm.
And Saidiya Hartman is a writer who several listeners will have heard about her idea of critical fabulation. It's become a thing that I think ancient people have picked up. She was on the syllabus, the sort of the core syllabus for this class, with a essay called Venus in Two Acts, which is where she first talks about critical fabulation. That my beef with not her, but ancient writer or ancient historians picking that up is oftentimes people will pick that up and say, "Oh, look, here's a person who said we can use critical fabulation to just imagine our way through the sources." And if you read that Venus in Two Acts essay, she entertains the prospect of doing it, and then by the end of the essay decides ethically, no, I should not do this. This is something I don't choose to do. And I think, people who are looking for license to think about the sources differently don't quite let that latter part of the article land. And
Mm.
so I was looking at that article, I was interested in other things she'd written, and I was like, what else has she written? And her first book is called Scenes of Subjection. It's about the American experience around slavery and how not just the institution, but the people in the institution, particularly white people, really, really liked to play act, not just in minstrelsy, like that's a hard word to say, minstrelsy, like white people play acting
Hmm.
as Black people,
Hmm.
but slave owners getting their enslaved people to act as if they were happy, getting them to act as if they were enjoying themselves. I mean, the song Dixie is a first person speech of an enslaved person who is no longer enslaved and wishes that they were again, right? Like, so there's a lot of
Mm.
performance of emotional contentment and happiness being extracted from people who are enslaved. And so that book pointed out to me, even when a white writer, there's several white writers at the time, both before the Civil War and after, try to embody the experience of Black enslaved people by speaking as them. And Hartman has this beautiful chapter where she takes that rhetorical move apart and she says, this seems like it's aimed at empathy, but it's actually just more use of the enslaved person, their experience, and their voice. And I thought, oh, what seems like empathy in these speeches in character can actually be a tool for more power and more domination. And then, when you read them, it's again a 13 or 14-year-old boy speaking as a woman and kind of getting it a little just off. Like they're
Mm-hmm.
heavy-handed.
Mm-hmm.
They're odd. They're odd in the ways that I think sometimes modern readers will look at modern novel writers who are male writing women and be like, that's not, you're writing about a woman thinking about her body in a way that she would just never think about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so some of these speeches in character are so just over the top that you think this is a performance that allows the writer to think they know what's going on with that person. And I started wondering, does that performance create a character who persists even when you're no longer doing the exercise? And maybe even like a stereotype about women that persists even when you're not doing that exercise. And I found the
Mm-hmm.
answer was, yeah, I think so.
Like my paradigm for the world includes a section for you. I I've got you. I know you. I know who you are. I know what you're doing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And when I meet you, here, I mean, this is the other thing that Sadie Hartman made clear. When I meet you, if you act differently than what I expect you to, I'll suspect you're lying. I'll suspect you're play acting. I really know you because I've seen you. I've been you. I know that you're actually X, Y, and Z and not these other things that you
Mhm.
appear to me as an individual person to be.
Or you're falling short of the standards that I set for a sex worker who has actually, uh, reformed her life, and so you
Yeah.
haven't.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, to a certain degree, you are also impersonating this boy, whom you have imagined.
Fair.
I mean,
Accurate.
th this is a real character that they existed, but the way you discuss the text, you're kind of imagining this boy, and you have to imagine what he's up to, the constraints, the goals, and so on. So, does your reading of this boy apply also? Does
I
your
mean,
reading of the speech and character as a kind of domination apply also to your reading of the boy?
it has to, only fairly and only logically. But if you think about it, my field, early Christian studies, is often modern people attempting to understand the motivations and even speak as the people that they're writing about. So,
Mm,
there's a probably a greatest hits list of maybe 25 to 40 writers. John Chrysostom, Augustine, Gregory of
mm,
Nyssa, Gregory, like I could list them off, but there's a lot of writing that tries to speak to those people's motivations and maybe even represent what they thought they were doing. So I think on some level, historians do it all the time. And the other thing that gives me, the ability to sleep at night that I'm doing this is, first off, this person is long gone, and second off, I am not taking away any power from that
no, no, no.
person.
Yeah,
You know what I
certainly.
mean? Like
Yes,
it's quite
certainly.
different.
Yes, yes.
This is also Saidiya Hartman in the Venus in Two Acts essay. The end of that essay, the last, say, third of it, is her ethically wondering what it's like for her, in her case, to speak about a woman who the only record about this woman is that she has a sexualized nickname and she's killed. Those are the things that we know about her. So, what does it mean to bring her back up into salience?
Hmm.
It's quite different than me, and I'm not even at some point talking about any one particular boy. I'm talking about boys in the rhetorical curriculum.
Yeah. Also, it really did help me to imagine the scene because otherwise we just have the text. And you might be able to think through to the circumstances of its composition and delivery. But I mean, and that's what you do, and it's very helpful in that way. Like I had not actually thought of it quite so far. And anyway, yeah, no, there are remarkable things that they were asked to do and impersonate. But I don't. Is this in your? I don't know if you mentioned this one. It's the 12th century. It's 12th century. It's what does Hades say when Lazarus is resurrected?
This is the thing. Extremely adult themes. Part of what I think part of what works there is you get used to what's the word? Professing about extremely adult themes even while you're young. Then you feel
Mhm.
confident and comfortable really professing with authority about anything.
Yeah. Yeah, that's no, I
So,
think that's the goal.
yeah.
I think it's that. It's just to be able to self-confidently be whoever and whatever you need to be in that moment to, yeah. No, I think that's exactly it. And that some of these scenarios are so outlandish just because they're practice. Anyway,
And the
okay.
practice, I mean, the outlandishness gives you some tension to work with. Like nobody
Yeah, yeah.
wants to watch what is, what does Hades say on a regular day when there's like 30,000 new people?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
That's boring. Okay. So this imaginary character, this prostitute, this sex woman, it generated sequels that you talk about, and even a fully fledged narrative in the form of the life of Maria of Egypt. Now we can't talk about them all in detail. If you're interested, listeners can go read the book and should. What's going on here? Like, why does this rhetorical character, an imagined, you know, um, person from the rhetorical classroom, have such a literary career, right, as a stock figure in these texts? And in particular, you discuss the what you call the anonymous sequel. And you say, and I quote, "It's the most ethically complex late antique text that I have encountered." What is going on there?
Oh, it's fantastic. And it is, I found it at the back of an appendix. Eugenio Amato published a series of texts from Severus, who's a grammarian and has some rhetorical texts that, he was editing. And then he put at the back this text that was attributed to him, but is very obviously not from Severus. It's from a Madrid manuscript that's probably 5th century or 6th century. And it's not a speech and character, it's a speech, it's a declamation that is by the woman who is a sex worker who's come to her senses, so a woman who has become wise, and she's speaking to her former lovers. And the speech is not actually her necessarily directly speaking to her former lovers, but she's announcing what she's gone through. The transition she's made to being wise happened a long time ago, and she talks all about how she herself is now wise. She makes wise decisions, and yet nobody around her has changed how they treat her. They keep treating
Mm-hmm.
her and judging her according to what
Mm-hmm.
she used to be. And this is all part of, this is all in a system that says, oh, you should strive to become better. You should strive for more virtue or discipline. You should strive for wisdom. And of course, that will improve everything. But she is marking that it hasn't improved a thing. And everybody keeps treating her as if she's worthless. And at one point, and this is what drew my attention at the beginning, or what drew my attention at the beginning, she says, even priests try to keep us out. So whoever the author of this is, the woman who is speaking
Mm-hmm.
is conceived as a Christian who is no longer and not able to be part of a church because of what she used to do, which, Christianity in the abstract is about redemption and
Mm-hmm.
change
Mm-hmm.
and coming away from sin and that sort of thing. So it's I'm not doing it justice with this description. It is quite complex, and she
Yes.
goes through all of the results of being stereotyped in a certain way.
Yeah. No, your analysis brings all of that out. And the Christian context is so important because I can easily imagine that in antiquity you could never expect society to overlook your past in that way, but in certain, Christian discourses in certain contexts does allow for that possibility. And what happens when they're not following through on that? And anyway, no, yeah, it was an interesting text. I put it on a short list that I'm keeping of texts that I might describe like this, ethically complex. Anyway, no, I was going to use that for a different purpose. So let's turn to your second case study now.
Sure.
Now this looks at the mystery of whether other people around you are genuine Christians or not. So why is this a problem in our period?
Well, after the start of the fourth century, there are so many people who are either becoming Christian or becoming more affiliated with churches or becoming more aware of Christianity as a thing you could be affiliated with. And I'm being vague there because part of the issue is with such an influx of people,
Hmm.
a thing that is difficult to determine is how committed is this person? Say, for example, do they understand that um, going to hear a speaker at a church on a Sunday means no longer attending a synagogue on a Friday or a Saturday? Famously, John Chrysostom
Hmm.
complains that the people that he's preaching to they don't understand that they shouldn't also be going to the synagogue. So understanding Christianity as an exclusive thing, and also something that many Christian writers hoped would be thoroughgoing, meaning it would change all of your life. Blake Lyerly has a book out right now called Christians at Home that is about, again, John Chrysostom. He does a lot of preaching, so there's a lot of source material, um, asking people to change the way that they lived in their households as a result of affiliating with him and affiliating with
Hmm.
Christianity. So, with so many new people, Christian writers themselves were worried, oh, is this person really getting it? Are they really Christian? Are they really committed? And there was a organizational way to know that, i.e., a person who has been through initiation and has been baptized. That should be a Christian, or that should be an indication that they're a Christian. And we have a fair number of writers wondering about that and being concerned that that isn't sufficient evidence that someone's a Christian. Namely, you could go through initiation of a year or 3 years, be baptized, and still maybe not be exactly right according to these folks. So there needed to be some other kind of evidence that you could point to, be like, ah, they're a Christian. Or in the case of the things that I write about in the chapter, they're not Christian. I know it, and I need to prove it somehow, even though they've said and done all the right things publicly.
Yeah. I relied heavily on this ambiguity in some my early work because you can never know these writers, even the writers that we have, in a context where so many are complaining that the incentives are all lined up to at least pretend that you're a Christian.
Yep.
There's lots of incentives, right? When I started reading your chapter, I thought of some religious colleges in the United States. When you apply for jobs there, some will ask for a letter from your priest, pastor, whatever, to basically answering this question for them. Like, is this person not just a member in good standing of your religious community, but like actively engaged in this,
Yeah.
such that you can't fake it on an application that easily? I think that's the idea. Anyway, so to answer this question, you and apparently a number of people in late antiquity turned to buildings, to architecture, to answer the question of what's going on inside someone's mind. So, what is the relationship between the soul, the mind, and a building in this context?
I think it's a relationship of opportunity, i.e., Christians are interested in finding evidence for what they already know in their guts, I guess, about other people. And buildings are a resource for doing that because of two things that are happening. First, already buildings are a thing that are um, slightly different than people, but also slightly different than the just natural environment, right? Like buildings have a kind of a vibe or a way of interacting with human beings that develops over time such that they have a personality. My example for my students for this is always, and buildings get us to act a certain way. So I always talk to my students about this in the following way. I say, like, here I am at the front of a classroom. There might be 50 students in the seats. Not one of those people came in the first day and stood as a student up by the board and just waited for class to start. They all sat down in their chairs. They took out their little desks, their little fold out desks, and I stood at the front of the classroom. And that's how they knew I was the professor. If I
Hmm.
sat in the back row, they would just never know. Some old ladies in the back row, who is that? So we inhabit a context where the person who's going to speak and teach the class stands at the front, everybody else sits down. But there's no rule that says we have to. We've all learned that, right? Like we've learned that over time. And buildings tend to work on us in that same way. In that, the fancy way I think people would say this is buildings afford certain behaviors now. There's affordances built into the structure. So first, ancient people knew that and took advantage of it. But um, like remaking a basilica, like refurbishing a basilica is one thing, but then taking a church and making it basilica shaped is saying a very specific set of things about what's in the apse and how you have to relate to the
Hmm.
thing in the apse. Um, but then also Christians had some ongoing theories about buildings being like people. There's a scholar at the University of Louisville, Catherine Kleinkopf, who has written about ascetics, particularly, and especially the ones who live out in like hermitages, like not people living in a monastery, but choosing a cave or choosing a tomb, being perceived as if they have merged with that thing, such that the outside of their habitation becomes like their skin. So there are some inklings in early Christian literature that buildings have started to sort of feel a little bit personal. And then there's the other part of it, which is Tina Sesser, your former colleague, has written about how Christians get really excited about the fact that there is a private inner room in fancy Roman houses.
Hmm.
And that private inner room is a place where they really want people to be doing the right kind of religious activity. So praying, thinking about Christian themes, maybe even doing some Christian writing. But they suspect that people are doing other kinds of religious activity there. So in the stories in the chapter, one of them involves a Christian breaking into another guy's house, a guy who used to be a Roman government official, like a provincial official, breaking into his house and getting all the way to the middle to find his secret little stash of non-Christian, implements.
Yeah, yeah.
They're really concerned that the middle of that house has something almost like, our guts, like the guts of a house. We talk about the guts of a house. The guts of the house are going to
Mm-hmm.
let you know what's going on organically inside that house.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, this reminds me very much like, let's say, 20th century American sort of obsessions or about people's sexual lives. And it's like, quote, what goes on in the bedroom? In other words, you might have one persona
Yep.
in your public life, right? But there's this question mark about some people, some of you think you know, but you don't know the truth unless you can like break into their bedroom at night or something.
Oh, they call it the closet for a reason, right? Like being in the closet or not. Yeah, totally.
Oh, right. Not just the
Right.
bedroom,
It's
but
it's
yeah.
odd to think that, yeah, I mean, your listeners may or may not know I'm a lesbian. Like thinking about what is my orientation by phrasing it as is she in the closet or not is such a weird mix of persona and building.
And building,
And
yeah, 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 yeah.
a version that is not what's happening in antiquity, not exactly that, but there is a version of that where we're asking built structures, especially the property of people, to stand in for something about that person that can't be evidenced in some other way.
What other kinds of things do they find in people's homes that is the gotcha moment in late
Ah,
antiquity?
well, there's a traditionalist cult implements, so like little statues or incense or an altar. You could find these various things in somebody's house. There's one story in the chapter where a man who says that he is Christian invites the mob that's hunting down insufficiently Christian people into his house, and he's got a picture of Jesus on the wall. And while he's standing there, the
It's
picture keeps flipping over. And if you look closely at it, once it flips over, it's actually an image of Apollo. And it happens three times. The story, like it's a narrative structure, but the
mm,
in the story it happened three times. He flips it back over, it flips again. He flips it back over, he flips again. And the mob, somebody comes and looks very closely and discovers, oh no, he actually has an image of Apollo in his house rather than of Christ. So you know, it's religious implements,
yeah.
in this case, iconography. That's from John of Ephesus. It's a relatively late piece. I think it would be fair to call it an icon. But it's things that might show they're doing practices that are not approved.
Yeah, what I found was a common thread running through these episodes is that the suspicion was prior to the revelation,
100%.
right? In other words, there's something else that's triggering the suspicion, and breaking into someone's house or bedroom or whatever, it just merely confirms it. And while I was reading this, I was thinking of the way we would react if we could open politicians' bank accounts today. It's like the suspicion is not because we have that information, but that information would confirm it, right?
I I think often yes, there are other things that are picking up people's, making people's senses prickle a little bit. In the case of some of these Christian, like the guy who breaks into someone's house and goes deep into his bedroom to find his little statues, that's a person who really wanted Christianity to be pervasive and wanted, I think, was locked in a bit of a struggle with someone who also had authority in his village and in his area. So on some level, I think you have to be suspicious of this kind of witch hunt, but at the same time, we are uh, our world is embroiled in a situation of emails being released that prove kind of what we knew about people in the first
Mm.
place.
Hmm.
you
Yeah, yeah,
know,
yeah, exactly.
I'm
Exactly.
thinking about Larry Summers right now. So Larry Summers, former president of Harvard, et cetera, et cetera. There's several emails going around where he himself has written emails that are actually just sleazy and terrible and misogynistic. And you could ask women in economics or women in economic history, is this a person who thinks women are equal thinkers or equally intelligent? And you would say, of course, no, because his public comments represented that. So I'm not surprised to see these
Right,
emails
right, right.
from Larry Summers. I'm surprised at how openly misogynistic they are. I don't want to see his closet or his cubiculum, or I'm not interested. Just don't need to know more.
Yes.
Uh, so
W-
I have some suspicion, and indeed, by the end of that chapter, the chapter that we're talking about, I talk about how this can be a license for people to be invasive, to do things like convince themselves that what they need to do is break into someone's house or be a mob and actually go interrupt the ritual that they know is happening and kill a couple people. You know, like it's a license for violence, and sometimes indeed violence against people to say, oh gosh, I need to know something about them. Let me now go invade their property.
My thinking was about the people who were actually so good at impersonating being Christians that no one suspected them in the first place. Because, because clearly they existed too. But it is in their nature to not leave that kind of trail.
It also raises the question of what being Christian, what, you know, like, so it's very
Of
clear
course,
for some
sure.
Christian writers what that means is you are Christian all the time. You are always thinking exclusively
Yeah,
about
yeah,
these
yeah.
things. You're rejecting a bunch of stuff in the past. And there are very obviously people who, if you had walked up to them and said, are you Christian? They would say, sure. But what that meant for them is a far less black and white affiliation
Yeah,
with
yeah,
the
yeah.
tradition. So there's a range of Christian, being part of a Christian community that isn't as sort of gung ho as the people that are mostly writing about it would make it
Yeah,
seem
yeah.
like. Yeah.
No, for sure. I mean, I know my father, total atheist, communist leaning, built churches in his village. Like that,
Yeah.
those two things are just completely different. But anyway, yeah, it was always very
There's
complex.
participating in a culture, and then there's commit. Yeah.
Yeah,
Another
yeah.
example that I make to my students is there's a local coffee shop here called Comic Coffee. It's the best coffee ever. I love it so much. It's maybe 3 stores away from a Starbucks. And when we talk about Christian writers who are saying you can no longer go to the synagogue, you may no longer participate in these festivals because they're not Christian, I say they're trying to convince people that if you like Comic Coffee, you can no longer get coffee anywhere else. Because many of the people involved think, oh, I'm going to a festival. They don't think I'm going to a Christian festival, or I'm going to this other festival for a dead person,
Yeah.
or this other festival in which we all do the same thing on a certain month or a certain day. That kind of exclusivity that you realize, oh, only the Christian festivals are the legitimate ones is a hope of many Christian writers. But it wasn't, I don't think, the experience of most people, even in antiquity. I think it was far less black and white than that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Ellen, we've covered a couple of we've hinted at what's going on in a couple of these chapters. They're very dense, and like I said, I really like the way you work through the thoughts in there and unpack the assumptions that you're finding in the sources. We're out of time, but I would like you to gesture toward the fourth chapter, which is the Fayum portraits, which is something that I think most of our listeners will have seen one of these at one point or another and have been impressed by it. And your chapter was so eye-opening. I mean, I, I knew very little about some of this background that you uncovered, but wow. So, yeah, tell us something that will entice more people to go at least read that chapter, which I think is phenomenal.
So a Fayum portrait, if you have seen one, you've seen one, and even if you don't think you've seen one, you've probably seen one. It is a frontal facing. It almost looks like a passport photo, but a painting from antiquity. And the chapter unpacks how those paintings got produced into things that look like we're seeing an individual from antiquity. Oh gosh, wow, look how realistic these are. And they were actually, they're not paintings that are done to stand alone. They're paintings that are part of a mummy object or an embalming object.
Yeah.
And in the 19th century, collectors just sliced them off of those
I see.
objects and left the objects behind. So I tell the story in the chapter about how they get produced, but also the context in which they get produced. The 19th century was also a time when photography with light became a technology that wasn't just a few people could do it, but it became you can have a picture of your beau or you can have a picture of your child. And people started thinking about photography as being able to represent essences of people. And there's a way that the production of the Fayum portraits and the exhibition of them, the selling of them, is really tied up in assumptions about photography. And later it helps that modern, like maybe 20th century and 21st century people talk about them. Like me, I just said, oh, look, they look like a passport photo. They look like an identification photo. Well, they do to people like us because we live in the world of passport
Hmm.
photos. They were in a totally different medium for ancient people who did not live in the world of passport photos. We aren't all carrying around pictures of ourselves in our wallets.
Yeah, and it ties in with the theme of the book very nicely because those portraits are used so often to try to divine, the lives of people because they're so in a way realistically rendered. At least they not only they appear that way to us, but have been made to appear that way in the way that they're presented. And when I started to realize, well, I mean, you have some of the images where you show how they might have originally been positioned, and it's so alien in some ways. Like part of this mummy was directly above the face of the dead individual inside, and like it's completely different to picture them that way. Anyway,
And I mean, not we, but the people who first extracted them and exhibited them took them out of that context.
yeah,
And now, when you see them in a museum, what you're seeing is a face on the wall. And of course, you're brought to think, oh, what was that person's life like? And
yeah,
what was it? How did that painter get them so realistic? It must be an individual. Well, of course it was, but we've taken them out of their context and away from any evidence of that. So
yeah.
they are, I say in the chapter, they're a machine that's made to make us wonder, but very predictably because they were taken out of their context. So we, quote unquote, can't know anything about these people, except at one point we did.
Yeah.
And the kind of engine of exhibiting them has removed them from that context.
Yeah. Ellen,
And
this was a delight to read, and to talk with you about it. So I strongly encourage everybody to go read. It's a fun book and it's short. It's yeah, what, 150 pages.
somewhere in there, but
Yeah.
also very nicely, like it's smaller than it's not densely packed.
It's not dense.
You
No,
can't
no,
just
no,
sit and
no.
read it.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you for having me on. This is a labor of love, very obviously on your part, and I'm actually impressed at how long this podcast has gone on. It's
I
been
can't believe
years
it.
and years and books, and you're doing a great service. I listen to it on my walk back and forth to school because I'm like,
Right.
well, I need to catch up on what's going on and
Well, thank you.
get some
But
Byzantium friends.
this type of book is the ideal kind of book for this podcast. Not just because it's short, but because it's fun, and it gets me thinking. And yeah, some of the books that I cover are like really dense, esoteric monographs sometimes. And yeah, that's also part of the.
Those are great books too.
Yep,
There's
we need
there's
we
no
need
bad
all
book here.
kinds. We need all kinds. So I'm glad that you engaged in this act of impersonation and wrote the lecture book that maybe one day, maybe now you'll be invited to do that and you'll have to think of a new topic.
I'll have to say no because I'll be on to the next thing.
You'll think
You
of
don't run the
something else.
old gag, you run the next gag.
All right, Ellen. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon.